Hey, I definitely not a kind of social commentary person, but I, like everybody else, have been completely enthralled by this Drake v. Kendrick Lamar rap beef. And honestly, it was great for me because I haven't really followed hip hop as an older millennial. I haven't really followed hip hop music in a while, and hearing the lyricism that was brought forth really inspired me again, especially as a person who writes music and writes poetry. It was just nice to see. But since, it's effectively pretty much over at this point, there have been a lot of conversations that I've seen popped up, and one that I wanted to speak on just because it relates to my own experience, and I thought I could share about it, and that's regarding the Canadian Black experience. And so I saw that there was a response from a young lady from Montreal who was born in Montreal, Canada, and she spoke on her experience. I thought I'd add to it as somebody who was raised in Toronto but was born in Jamaica, and migrated here when I was in elementary school. And so the thing that I want to say about Canadian culture from my perspective is Canadian Black culture specifically is that it looks different for everybody pretty much. And that's why I think it's difficult to pinpoint what a Canadian rapper would sound like or a Canadian artist would sound like. And I'll tell you why that is. When you come from another country to Canada, so as a Black person, you are always affiliated with that country. That's not a bad thing. It's just a fact of the experience here, at least to my understanding. So you will never, I think, be able to just tell somebody you're Canadian without them asking, okay, so know where you from? Like, yeah, you have your citizenship, but where are you from? And then if you're born here, you're like, I was born here. Okay, then where are your parents from? So it's always digging back, however many, even if you tell them your grandparents were born, well, then where did they come from? It's sort of like you're not Canadian and you will never be. You are a Canadian national because you have your citizenship, but like, let's get to where you're really from. And that's one of the things that is wrapped up in this whole identity thing, because depending on where you're emigrating from as a Black Canadian, that's going to deeply and profoundly shape your cultural experience as a Black Canadian. Because if you look at the difference between the symbolism of what represents the culture of the US and the culture of Canada, one being the melting pot, which is the US, and one being the mosaic, which is Canada, it will show you where this absence of a distinct, definable, and discernible Canadian culture comes from. So in the US, the melting pot means that, similar to Jamaica, out of many one people, the US takes out of, many different experiences, we put them together and create this new thing, which is the US culture and the US experience. In Canada, it's out of many, many people. So it's like, okay, you come from where you're from, and we'll take you and we'll put you in this patch of the mosaic, and then we'll take you who are from somewhere else and put you in this patch of the mosaic, and then we'll take you. There's no integration and consolidation to create a new thing in terms of the Black experience. It remains very much separated, and that goes to show even in the way our symbolism is represented. Additionally to that, I think most people, Black Canadians who were born elsewhere, have the experience where at some point, for the first few years, they are very much centered in the culture they came from or where their parents came from. And they're accepted as that. But there comes a certain point where you spend a certain amount of time in Canada, and the people from your country might say, what do you mean? You're not like us. Basically, you're not like us. That's. And so I went through that where, by the time I was here for, 7 years or 10 years, Jamaican people who I'd meet here, who came here as adults, would be like, you're not Jamaican, you're Canadian. Then the Canadians were like, you're not Canadian, you're Jamaican. And that, when you're a child, causes this kind of identity crisis, like nobody wants me, right? And then now you have to start building your identity, cultural and otherwise, once you've come to the point where you're basically disenfranchised from both of your cultures. So it's either you lean in and say, I don't care what they're talking about, I am Jamaican, for example. Or, you know what, they're right, I am Canadian. And then you most likely latch onto and associate with things that are affiliated with Canadian culture, which is more predominantly white, you know. And so that's the reason why the experience is so different for everybody, because you're building your own. It's like, you build it according to what your experiences are. So, for example, in the broadest sense, what a Nigerian Canadian rapper would sound like would be different than a Jamaican Canadian rapper would sound like, which is different than a Ghanaian, you know, Canadian rapper, and so on and so on and so forth, because they will be pulling from the music of their place of birth, or their parents' place of birth, and integrating it into rap music. So they will be borrowing from their own place of birth, as well as America. American culture is huge in Black culture in Canada, because even though we have Black history and different things like that, the history that is taught to us focuses heavily around American culture. And so that is our first exposure to, not just to say Black Canadian, but North American Black experiences. And those are associated with the United States. So what you will see is we'll pull from our own experiences, we'll pull from our parents' experiences, we'll pull from the Black Canadian, the Black American experience, and then we'll create something that is unique to us. And so the closest that you'll ever come to probably seeing what a Black Canadian rapper would look like would be, from in the 90s, where you had Maestro Fresh West, and you had after that, I think Maestro Fresh West was like in the late 80s, early 90s. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, you had, Cardinal Official, and you had the Rascals, and, different people like that who brought that kind of sound. But even with Cardinal Official, who was like, our front runner for the longest time, one of his songs that I remember when it came on 106 in Park was Bacardi Slang. And that tells you, because he is of Jamaican background, and the experience, he says, when, we say, you know what I mean? We say, you don't know. That's Jamaican slang. And that comes from his experience being of that culture. And so it's a perfect example of how it will look completely different depending on who you are. So this is not really me saying that anything having to do with the whole culture vulture conversation. This is strictly about culture. And the last thing that I want to say is, in terms of racism, because you come here and it's not known that there's racism in Canada, as a child, you have to figure that out on your own. You will have experiences and not know why. It's like, okay, well, why is my mark this? And I'm the one who helped this person write. Or the only time when you can be assured of your mark is when, with some people, not everybody, with some teachers, is when there's no subjectivity. It's where it's a math question and, it's right or wrong. But even in that, I remember distinctly when I was younger, I could, do calculations in my head and all of those different things, because in Jamaica, what we were doing in second grade was vastly ahead of what was being done here. And so it was very boring for me. But because I came from Jamaica, I was not allowed to do things in my head. I had to show my work. Whereas another student who came from an Asian country was able to just do it in their head. So it's those things that you have to piece together and then realize, oh, okay, this might be racially motivated. So there's a lot of learning, processing, integrating, and then defining that has to happen first. Okay. Take care.